Friday, thousands of Israelis marched through Tel Aviv to mark International Human Rights Day.
Human rights right now! Human rights right now! Human rights right now! Human rights right now!
Various groups fighting for human rights in Israel came together in this march. They included African refugees, right-wing communities, and the global Occupy movement. But the march was organized to protest a wave of laws right-wing and religious parties are currently passing through parliament. The Association for Civil Rights in Israel called this collection of laws anti-democratic. Libby Lankinsky is their Director of International Relations.
And by anti-democratic, we're basically looking at 4 categories of legislative initiatives that are coming up at various speeds and with various fervor in our Knesset. The first is a whole slew of legislation aimed at limiting the rights of the Arab minority in Israel. And these are a spate of legislation that call into question various things like loyalty. The second trend that we see are a group of legislative bills and now some laws which aim to limit the ability for civil society to operate, specifically targeting human rights NGOs and political NGOs that don't tote the party line, as it were. The third re-arising trend are a group of initiatives aimed at the High Court of Justice. And then the fourth is direct freedom of expression limitations, both aimed at the press and again at civil society. So things like the most recent amendment to the libel law. And for us, the most worrying thing about some of these trends is that they create a serious chilling effect where people who aim to voice important criticism of Israeli government policy have to think twice before they do so.
In preparation for Human Rights Day, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu recorded a special address, claiming Israel is a model of human rights in the region. Specifically, Netanyahu outlined the right to protest, comparing the social justice movement of the summer to the Arab Spring.
We're proud to be a country that is governed by laws, not men, where protests in town squares is a way of life. It's not a sign of revolution. People go to the squares, they give voice to whatever protests and grievances they have. They do it on the internet, they do it in the newspapers, they do it on television, they do it in our parliament, the Knesset, in a robust, dynamic and free way that is an example for the entire democratic world.
While the Human Rights March was held in Tel Aviv, an hour away in the West Bank, dozens of Palestinian villages were holding their weekly nonviolent demonstrations. In Abi Saleh, the protest ended when 3 demonstrators sustained serious injuries. Mustafa Tamimi is a 28-year-old resident of the village. He was shot at close range with a high-velocity tear gas canister by a soldier from a military jeep. The army then delayed the ambulance, and Tamimi died from his injuries the next day. According to the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, he's the 20th protester since 2004 to be killed by Israeli soldiers in such protests.
It's important when talking about the freedoms that the J14 movement experienced throughout the summer to point out that at that same time and for years before this and continuously until today, Palestinians in the West Bank are not given that same right to protest. Palestinians living in the West Bank are subject to Israeli military law. They're not tried in the same legal system as Israelis, the civilian courts inside Israel. Military Order 101 creates a situation, or states fully, that any gathering of Palestinians of above 10 people or more, needs to require a special permit, needs to obtain a special permit from the occupying power, from the Israeli authorities. The backdrop of those protests is that Palestinians are protesting against the occupation. They are not going to they're not going to request a permit from the occupier in order to do those protests. So ostensibly, Military Order 101 creates a situation in which every protest in the occupied territories of Palestinians is illegal.
Military Order 101 forbids displaying the Palestinian flag, printing of political posters, and bans the gathering of more than 10 people for a political purpose or for a matter that may be construed as political.
often people's freedom of movement is limited as a means for blocking protests from occurring. So either by putting into place closed military zones around the specific areas the protests are taking place, or simply blocking cars from arriving at the protest site. Another way is through excessive use of force in crowd dispersal. Often protests which haven't even started yet are already dispersed. The villages of Bilin and Nialin were declared closed military zones semi-permanently every Friday from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. So it's clear that that's being used in order to limit the possibility of protests from happening. We see a lot of misuse of weapons. For example, shooting projectile tear gas canisters directly at protesters instead of in an arc fashion, which is how they're meant to be used. And then another topic is a whole system of arrests, both that take place during the protests, where whoever is standing near the soldiers could potentially be arrested, and often it's youth that are involved in stone throwing or other parts of the protest, but also night arrests that happen during the night in various Palestinian villages, where Israeli military or security forces will go into a village and arrest people that are suspected of being part of protests. So you can see direct campaigns in particular villages of arresting the protest leaders.
The difference between the Israeli and Palestinian right to protest was especially evident during the summer social justice movement, known as the July 14th or the Israeli summer. While many were arrested, not a single protest was met with tear gas, stun grenades, rubber or live ammunition, as is common in the West Bank. Even during Mustafa Tamimi's funeral on Sunday, the army again invaded the village and showered the mourners with tear gas and skunk, a fluid that smells like sewage and is shot from a water cannon truck. 3 people were injured and 8 arrested. The Tel Aviv march was also challenged by nationalist and settler organizations, waving Israeli flags and singing the national anthem. Hanin Zouabi is a member of the Israeli parliament. Her parliamentary privileges were revoked because she participated in the Freedom Flotilla humanitarian aid convoy to Gaza in 2010.
אז הגזענות לא התחילה לפני שנתיים, היא לא התחילה רק דרך ממשלתו של נתניהו. הגזענות נגד הערבים, עשרות חוקים בעד הפקעת אדמות שלא מכירות בפלסטיני כיליד של המולדת הזאת, זה גם השמאל בישראל. כאשר אנחנו אומרים אנחנו נלחמים בגזענות, כל התפיסה הזאת של מדינה אקסקלוסיבית ליהודים היא הבסיס לגזענות. ההתעוררות הזאת היא התעוררות חלקית, ואני חושבת שהיא לא יכולה, עד עכשיו, היא לא יכולה להציג אלטרנטיבה חזקה ואמיתית לגזענות.
In a form of political satire, anti-racist protesters dressed up as the KKK, as politicians and tycoons. For The Real News, I'm GeneratorJun in Tel Aviv.